can't be here today after his very profound and meaty lecture last Thursday. The question which I raised last time becomes only more urgent for me. This fact of which we have spoken last time, that ideas, the species, are not eternal, would render questionable the whole edifice as it was presented by Mr. Klein. And from this it would follow that one must address to Plato questions which Plato did not raise. Now, which question? How could he disregard, one could say to begin with, the possibility of the non-eternity of the species, especially since that possibility was discussed by other thinkers, and in fact by Plato himself, as we will see later on in the Laws. Now, of course, he did consider it. Or did he know that his whole edifice was questionable? And this is a point which Mr. Klein, as well as I, would agree, and that is indicated by the word skepticism, namely that Plato's successors became skeptics, which is an extremely crude version of what Plato himself did. Now, if the whole edifice is questionable, what then was there which was not questionable for Plato? We must here make, of course, a distinction. The things which were not questionable to him and the things which were reasonably not questionable to him, which are as evident to us than they were to Plato. To begin with, it could look as if this distinction is the same as that between Plato's moral political teaching and his cosmological or metaphysical teaching. Now, I think we must keep this in mind, but let us not, unless there is you have a very urgent desire to discuss it, I would say we should turn to the 8th book. We have only 2 more meetings, and in some way we must go through the Laws, however difficult it may be. Yes?
Just one point.
Yes.
The way you had announced the position last week, led me to suggest that the distinction between the cosmological thinking and the moral political teaching could not finally be made if one considers that the complete account of the moral political teaching means to understand the relationship between philosophy and politics. And philosophy, as Plato says, requires some kind of cosmological thinking to get it.
Yeah, well, but let me put it this way. That it makes sense to say that polis is a cave and everything that entails. And philosophy is an attempt to raise from the cave to the light of the sun. Now, what we find in leaving the cave, there may be a great variety of possibilities which are not settled by the fact that one must leave the cave. Do you see that one? And there are certain views about the whole which are incompatible with the moral life of man. Yeah? Say, unqualified hedonism, the denial of a distinction between the noble and the pleasant, and some other things. But generally speaking, it seems even necessary to make such a distinction. But one can, of course, say, and I believe I said this last time, if one follows the modern view, and not merely as stated by Darwin or so, then one may indeed be compelled to abandon the notion of philosophy is leaving the cave. If philosophy is, as it is according to many people, a part of culture, yeah? And the culture is, of course, belongs essentially to the polis, then it's impossible to leave the cave. And then what becomes of truth? And what becomes of philosophy? That is a great question. And I think that Nietzsche, in the first place, have been wrestling, and others have been wrestling with this question: how to find an intelligible substitute for Plato's view while abandoning the ideas. I think we have to leave it at that now. But now if we turn to Book 8, Book 7 dealt with education, and Book 8 turns to festivals, quite naturally. And festivals are inseparable from sacrifices. And there are a few passages which we should read, beginning in 828c. 125, bottom? Yes.
Further, they must determine, in conformity with the law, the rites proper to the nether gods, and how many of the celestial gods should be invoked, and what
the heavenly gods. Now, whether the heavenly gods are the Olympian gods or the cosmic gods, sun, moon, and stars, that is not easy to decide and cannot be decided on the basis of this passage alone. Yes?
How many of the heavenly gods should be invoked, and what of the rites connected with them should not be mingled but kept apart, and put them in the 12th month, which is sacred to Pluto. And this god should not be disliked by men who are warriors, but honored as one who is always most good to the human race. For, as I would assert in all seriousness, union is in no way better for soul and body than dissolution.
Yeah. Now, Pluto is, of course, Hades. And that would seem to mean that life is by no means better than death. And that death is, of course, not to be feared. And then from that, courage would follow. But whether this is the way in which Plato means it, that is hard to say. Let us continue where we left off.
Moreover, if they are to arrange these matters adequately, these persons must believe that no other state exists which can compare with ours in respect of the degree in which it possesses leisure and control over the necessities of life, and believe also that it, like an individual, ought to lead a good life. But for a good and blessed life, the first requisite is neither to do wrong oneself, nor to suffer wrong from others. Of these, the former is not very hard, but it is very hard to secure immunity from suffering wrong. Indeed, it is impossible to gain this perfectly, except by becoming perfectly good. So likewise, a state may obtain a life of peace if it becomes good, but if bad, a life of war, both abroad and at home. This being so, all men must train for war.
And so on. Now, this is the perfectly good man. He suffers no injustice. That is a remarkable statement. The most other statements on this subject, it is said, of course, he will suffer injustice, while he will never inflict injustice, but that will not deter him from following the course of justice. It is in conformity with an earlier statement, according to which he who has the divine goods will necessarily have the human goods as well. That is in 631b. And the divine goods being the virtues, and the human goods being health, wealth, and beauty, and so on. That thought is not pursued here any further, but I suppose there is a connection between this, although I am what he said here does not suffice for making it clear. Between this statement about the perfectly good man, that he suffers no injustice, and the assertion that life is not preferable to death. Now this is said right at the beginning of this book. And then he pursues the subject of festivals, war, preparation for war, festivals, sacrifices, in the first place gymnastics, and very briefly he touches again on music. And there we have to consider a few passages in 835c. It's on page 147.
But the things which do make no small difference, and of which it is hard to persuade men, these form a task especially for God, were it possible that orders should come from him. As it is...
In other words, that is interesting. Maybe God cannot give commands. At the end of Aristotle's Eudemian ethics it is said, God does not rule epitaktikos, giving commands. Aristotle means God rules by being what he is and by being the center of attraction for everything else. Plato seems here also to exclude the possibility of a divine commands properly understood. Yes?
As it is, they are likely to require a bold man who, valuing candor above all else, will declare what he deems best for city and citizens, and in the midst of corrupted souls will enjoin what is fitting and in keeping with all the constitution, and gainsay the mightiest lusts, acting alone by himself, with no man to help him, save as his solitary leader, reason.
Yes, so that we cannot hope for divine commands, so we have to rely on what we hear from the right kind of human beings. And they require an unusual parrhesia, willingness to say everything, frankness. Cleinias doesn't quite understand, yes? Go on.
Cleinias, what is it we are reasoning about now, stranger? For we are still in the dark. Athenian, naturally, but I will try to explain myself more clearly. When in my discourse I came to the subject of education, I saw young men and maidens consorting with one another affectionately, and naturally a feeling of alarm came upon me, as I asked myself how one is to manage a state like this, in which young men and maidens are well nourished, but exempt from those severe and menial labors which are the surest means of quenching wantonness, and where the chief occupation of everyone all through life consists in sacrifices, feasts, and dances. In a state such as this, how will the young abstain from those desires which frequently plague many into ruin, all those desires from which reason, in its endeavor to be law, enjoins abstinence?
Literally, reason, logos, trying or attempting to become law. You remember this complex relation between logos and nomos, across which we have come more than once. And that is stated here in a new way, that the logos has in itself the tendency, it wishes to become law, and which means, of course, that most of the time it will not achieve it. Therefore, the law ordinarily is not the logos. The subject at hand is clear. Education, and more particularly how to counteract sexual desires. Yes?
That the laws previously ordained serve to repress the majority of desires is not surprising. Thus, for example, the proscription of excessive wealth is of no small benefit for promoting temperance, and the whole of our education system contains laws useful for the same purpose. In addition to this, there is the watchful eye of the magistrates, trained to fix its gaze always on this point and to keep constant watch on the young people. These means, then, are sufficient, so far as any human means suffice, to deal with the other desires. But when we come to the amorous passions of children of both sexes, and of men for women, and women for men, passions which have been the cause of countless woes, both to individuals and to whole states, how is one to guard against these, or what remedy can one apply so as to find a way to escape in all such cases from a danger such as this? It is extremely difficult, Plinius, for whereas in regard to other matters, not a few, Crete generally and Lacedaemon furnish us, for whereas in regard to other matters, not a few, Crete generally and Lacedaemon furnish us, and rightly, with no little assistance in the framing of laws, which differ from those in common use in regard to the passions of sex. For we are alone by ourselves. They contradict us absolutely.
But he had referred to that. Is it not clear?
No, I can't understand.
In many other respects, they are the laws of Crete and Sparta are models. But in this crucial point, they fail us. And we can speak about it quite frankly, for we are alone. We are among ourselves. Yeah? And so that is clear. And he had spoken before of homosexuality in Crete, and they're supported by the myth of Ganymede. In the first book he spoke of them. And he also referred to this when speaking of Sparta. Now he comes back to that, and now the time for excuses and politeness has gone a long time ago. He can now speak with perfect frankness about the defects of the Dorian laws. Yes?
Is this an example of piracia that's crazy?
No, I don't think so. At least I don't see the connection. Maybe you are right, but I don't see the connection.
Should I read this sentence again?
Yeah, if you want to.
For Crete generally and Lacedaemon furnish us, and rightly, with no little assistance in the framing of laws, which differ from those in common use in regard to the passions of sex. For we are alone by ourselves. They contradict us absolutely. If we were to follow in nature's steps and enact that law which held good before the days of Laius.
Laius, that's of course the father of Oedipus, and he was supposed to have originated pederasty. And is, yes.
Declaring that it is right to refrain from indulging in the same kind of intercourse with men and boys as with women, and adducing as evidence thereof the nature of wild beasts, and pointing out how male does not touch male, for this purpose, since it is unnatural. In all this, we would probably be using an argument neither convincing nor in any way consonant with your states. Moreover,
namely with Sparta and Crete. Yeah. Moreover, this is the first reason. Homosexuality is against nature. Secondly,
moreover, that object which, as we affirm, the lawgiver ought always to have in view, does not agree with these practices. For the inquiry we always make is this, which of the proposed laws tends toward virtue, and which not. Come then, suppose we grant that this practice is now legalized, and that it is noble and in no way ignoble. How far would it promote virtue? Will it engender in the soul of him who is seduced a courageous character, or in the soul of the seducer a quality of temperance? Nobody would ever believe this. On the contrary, as all men will blame the cowardice of the man who always yields to pleasures and is never able to hold out against them, will they not likewise reproach that man who plays the woman's part with the resemblance he bears to his model? Is there any man then who will ordain by law a practice like that? Not one, I should say, if he has a notion of what true law is.
Yeah, if he has in his intellect the true law, nomos aletes, yes.
What then do we declare to be the truth about this matter? It is necessary to discern the real nature of friendship and desire and love, so-called, if we are to determine them rightly. For what causes the utmost confusion and obscurity is the fact that this single term embraces these two things, and also a third kind compounded of them both. Cleinias, how so?
First it is clear, pederasty is both against nature and it is not conducive to virtue, but rather to the opposite. Yeah? There are two different considerations here. And now the decision will ultimately, by the way, you are our specialists in biology. What about the statement of the other animals? I have only a very limited, extremely limited observation regarding dogs. And that is not entirely conclusive in agreement with what Plato says.
I really don't know. I was just thinking about that. I was thinking about the other species.
Yeah.
Really had information. Sorry.
You have no knowledge. Yeah.
Can I ask two questions on this passage?
Yeah, sure.
Would you, when he says that it is against nature, is that to be distinguished from the argument that it's conducive to vice and not to virtue?
Yeah, well, I believe the distinction is this. The physical consideration refers to all animals, to all humans. And that regarding virtue and vice refers to man only. So that does not contradict the fact that there is not a nature of man. But the first is based on consideration of all animals, and the second of man in particular. And here where these very striking remarks come, how can you imagine would the virtue of a seduced boy be increased if he were made the witness of the lack of self-control of someone who allegedly loves him? And so.
Sorry, can I ask one other thing? It seems to me that, I've read this properly, the discussion is whether homosexuality ought to be encouraged by law rather than whether it ought to be prohibited. That is, it seems not to be, he seems to couch whether the law really ought to ordain these practices now not being practiced.
No, it should.
No, but it doesn't deal with the question, for example, the question now being agitated as to whether the law ought not to take a more permissive attitude and tolerate it.
No, I believe it is clear. It should be forbidden against the president of these otherwise wonderful cities, Crete and Sparta. But he has not completed the discussion, because he will speak first of the ambiguity of friendship or love. And this is to which he comes now. Perhaps we should treat that first.
Athenian. Friendship is the name we give to the affection of like for like in point of goodness and of equal for equal, and also to that of the needy for the rich, which is of the opposite kind, and when either of these feelings is intense, we call it love. Cleinias, true. Athenian, friendship which occurs between opposites is terrible and fierce, and seldom reciprocal amongst men, while that based on similarity is gentle and reciprocal throughout life. The kind which arises from a blend of these presents difficulties. First, to discover what the man affected by this third kind of love really desires to obtain, and in the next place, because the man himself is at a loss, being dragged in opposite directions by the two tendencies, of which the one bids him to enjoy the bloom of his beloved, while the other forbids him. For he that is in love with the body and hungering after its bloom, as it were, as it were that of a ripened peach, urges himself on to take his fill of it, paying no respect to the disposition of the beloved. Whereas he that counts bodily desire as but secondary and puts longing looks in place of love, while with soul, lusting really for soul, regards the bodily satisfaction of the body as an outrage, and reverently worshipping temperance, courage, nobility, and wisdom, will desire to live always chastely, in company with the chaste object of his love. But the love which is blended of these two kinds is that which we have described just now as third. Since then love has so many varieties, ought the law to prohibit them all and prevent them from existing in our midst? Or shall we not plainly wish that the kind of love which belongs to virtue and desires the young to be as good as possible should exist within our state, while we shall prohibit, if possible, the other two kinds? Or what is our view, my dear McGillis? Your description of the subject, stranger, is perfectly correct. Athenian, it seems that, as I expected, I have gained your assent, so there is no need for me to investigate your law and its attitude toward such matters, but simply to accept your agreement to my statement. Later on, I will try to charm Cleinias also into agreeing with me on this subject. So let your joint admission stand at that, and let us by all means proceed with our laws. McGillis, quite right.
So in other words, there is a difference between McGillis and Cleinias at this point. McGillis is satisfied with his argument, and Cleinias still needs some further prodding, because this unnatural custom has much deeper roots in Crete than in Sparta.
But
yes?
Here, this paragraph is talking much more generally than that, isn't it? It's talking about bodily love as opposed to love that belongs to virtue, or somehow.
Yeah, then think of Socrates himself. And he obviously was attracted by beautiful youth, you know? But so that he regarded this eros as all right, but not when it led to homosexual deeds. You know? He makes here a distinction between seeing and enjoying. I mean, he who regards the desire for the body as a bywork, seeing rather than desiring, looking at the beautiful individual and not desiring to have in any way intercourse.
Like a sculpture? Like a sculptor would look?
Sculpture is not living.
No, I mean a sculptor, the man who makes a sculpture.
Yeah, perhaps. But at any rate, surely there is a mixture that makes it complicated. A mixture, the attractiveness of beautiful and gifted young men that is in between that kind of love where the body doesn't enter at all, and on the other where there is only loveless sex at the other pole. Yeah? That
So
complicates matters.
the middle type is more like Socrates and Alcibiades.
Yeah, but yes, as you can say that.
That would be one of the types that was outlawed.
Not quite.
Well, it says that they would throw away two of them and they would only keep the one with...
Yeah, the ultimate result is that.
So they would outlaw
Yes.
relationships
And
Socrates and Alcibiades.
yeah, this is a book of a legislator. Well, I always found that Plato as a legislator doesn't speak differently about this kind of abomination than Moses. Yeah? But Plato does make a distinction between the legislator and the non-legislator, which Moses does not make. And therefore he could write the banquet.
So perhaps even if Socrates hadn't been tried for his impiety, he wouldn't last very long in this state because he would be tried for his relationship with the young men that came to him. He might have the same treatment.
You must not forget that Socrates, he is a very old man now and will not live very long, and his relations will be limited to the most venerable old men with whom he will help in elaborating the laws. Yeah? Yes. So, now let us go on. We must read this section because there are some other points of some interest.
Athenian, I know of a device at present for an
Yeah, the word which it uses is techne. Yeah, you can translate it as device, but it's an art. Device would be more a mechane, which he does not use here. Yes?
I know of an art at present for enacting this law, which is in one way easy, but in another quite the hardest possible. McGillis, explain your meaning. Athenian, even at present, as we are aware, most men, however lawless they are effectively and strictly precluded from sexual commerce with beautiful persons, and that not against their will, but with their own most willing consent. McGillis, on what occasions do you mean? Athenian, whenever any man has a brother or sister who is beautiful, so too in the case of a son or daughter, the same unwritten law is most effective in guarding men from sleeping with them, either openly or secretly, or wishing to have any connection with them. Nay, most men never so much as feel any desire for such connection. McGillis, that is true. Athenian, is it not?
So now, what does this mean in the argument? So, while pederasty is against nature and against nomos aletheis, the true nomos, this is very insufficient. We need, in addition, an art, a technique. And now he will speak of that technique. And he makes this clear by speaking of incest, the clearest case where sexual restraint is successful. Yes?
Athenian, is it not then by a brief sentence that all such pleasures are quenched? McGillis, what sentence do you mean? Athenian,
Yeah, a little word you could almost say.
the word that these acts are by no means holy, but hated of God, and most shamefully shameful. And does not the reason lie in this, that nobody speaks of them otherwise, but every one of us from the day of his birth hears this opinion, expressed always and everywhere, not only in comic speech, but often also in serious tragedy, as when there is brought to the stage a
Theistic
or Oedipus,
or some Oedipus,
or a Macareus, having secret intercourse with a sister, and all these are seen inflicting death upon themselves willingly as a punishment for their sins. McGillis, thus much at least you are quite right in saying that public opinion has...
Yeah, public opinion is a bad translation. Fame, that means rumor, tradition, and the tradition of claiming sacred origin. Yes?
that sacred tradition
Yeah, all right.
has a surprising influence when there is no attempt by anybody ever to breathe a word that contradicts the law.
Yeah, you see, that is very important, because if there is criticism of that, then its force is weakened naturally. So if it is a revered tradition, which is not contradicted by anyone, yes?
Athenian, then is it not true, as I said just now, that when a lawgiver wishes to subdue one of those lusts which especially subdue men, it is easy for him at least to learn the method of mastering them, that is, by consecrating this sacred tradition in the eyes of all alike, bond and free, women and children, and the whole state, that he will effect the firmest security for this law. McGillis, certainly. But how it will ever be possible for him to bring it about that all are willing to say such a thing, I think a very proper observation. That was precisely the reason why I stated that in reference to this law, I know of an art for making a natural use of reproductive intercourse. On the one hand, by abstaining from the male and not slaying of set purpose the human stock, nor sowing seed on rocks and stones where it can never take root and have fruitful increase. And on the other hand, by abstaining from every female field in which you would not desire the seed to spring up. This law, when it has become permanent and prevails, if it has rightly become dominant in other cases, just as it prevails now regarding intercourse with parents, is the cause of countless blessings. For in the first place, it follows the dictates of nature, and it serves to keep men from sexual rage and frenzy, and all kinds of fornication, and from all excess in meats and drinks, and it ensures in husbands fondness for their own wives. Other blessings also would ensue in infinite number if one could make sure of this law.
Yeah. So here that the prohibition of incest shows through an unwritten law, shows how sexual desire could be restrained. There is nothing said of incest being against nature. That in here, pederasty, of course, but not of incest. And that is, of course, in agreement with the Republic, where you have, in fact, incest between brothers and sisters permitted. People don't know who their brothers and sisters are. And intercourse is permitted under strict governmental supervision between members of the same age group. But if you figure that out a little bit more precisely, you see that this makes possible even intercourse between parents and children. Because let us assume the age group be, say, from 15 to 30. And then the next from 30 to 50. The lines, if someone is, say, a woman is 29 or 25 and a man is 45, maybe father and daughter. Can happen. But the clearest example which I know of such a discussion prior to the laws occurs in Aristophanes' Assembly of Women, because there is laid down a law, communities of wives and children. So no one knows his parents, and the parents don't know their children. And secondly, no one is permitted to cohabit with someone of his age if he has not cohabited earlier with an old man or an old woman. And that means that since no one knows his parents, incest is even commanded by the law. At any rate, the Republic is of course milder, but it is also very far from agreeing with Plato. What Plato wants is a very severe sexual morality that you can see, and not even what the moral theologians call simple fornication should be permitted, and should be regarded as heinous a crime as incest. Now, whether there is any such sacred tradition which can bring that about as it brings about restraint from incest, that's a long question. And there are some remarks to that effect in the sequel, namely that this is not altogether easy to achieve. Yes?
It seems that here in the speech of the Athenian, he proposes two ways to bring about, or two parts to a law. One is not killing the children when they're born.
No, that he means simply sowing into the proper land, that's to say, having intercourse not with a woman.
He says, by abstaining from the male and not slaying of set purpose the human stock.
Yeah, that is the sin of honor in the Bible.
Well, he says that the men should only...
Yeah, he should only have intercourse with women, that's clear. And in addition with women who are not his near relatives. And in addition, they must be a woman from whom he wants to have a child. That's to say, not just a slave girl who attracts him. Yeah?
So that's a kind of control, birth control then.
Now, birth control you cannot call it, but strict control of manners. And what he would like to have is a society in which there is only intercourse between married couples, and which was, after all, until a short while ago, regarded as a proper thing by most people. I do not know whether, in fact, and then you would have to ask a sociologist, but surely according to what was said to me.
Yeah, the Pope still feels that.
Well, I think not only the Pope, yeah, other people also. Yeah, and yes. Now, this is, at any rate, the main point, if I may come back to this, the restraint of sexual desire is fundamentally brought about through piety. And that is the main point here. Yeah? That is a thought which has been restated later, much later, by a very unlikely man to say that, by Rousseau. In Rousseau's Emile, who is brought up by his tutor in strict ignorance of God, has to become instructed in natural theology in the moment when he reaches puberty. That's to say, when he is confronted with a kind of difficulty which the former, where natural reason by itself is unable to cope. I mean, regarding food and drink, he has learned that if he overeats, that is impractical. And if he gets drunk, that's also impractical. But in this respect, this wise rule is not strong enough, and therefore he needs the profession of faith of the Savoyard vicar. But as Mr. Bloom pointed out in his lecture, Rousseau follows Plato in very important points, and this is surely one of them. Now, let us then turn to Book 9. In 857 C, begin here, page 211.
Yeah. Athenian. Well Well said, Cleinias. You have collided with me when I was going, as it were, full steam ahead, and so have woken me up. You have reminded me of a previous reflection of mine, how that none of the attempts hitherto made at legislation have ever been carried out rightly, as in fact we may infer from the instance before us. What do I mean to imply by this remark? It was no bad comparison we made when we compared all existing legislation to the doctoring of slaves by slaves. For one should carefully notice this.
You remember that comparison, yeah? The two ingredients of law. The one is the slave doctor's treatment of slaves, and the other the freeman's treatment by free doctors. Yes. Yes.
For one should carefully notice this, that if any of the doctors who practice medicine by purely empirical methods, devoid of theory, were to come upon a freeborn doctor conversing with a freeborn patient and using arguments much as a philosopher would, dealing with the course of the ailment from its origin and surveying the natural constitution of the human body, he would at once break
and
out...
so on. That is the first time that the word philosophine occurs in the laws, and it may be the only time, but surely the first time. And it is used in connection with the subject, the whole physics of bodies. Of course, it would also mean the whole physics of souls. This is, I thought, worth mentioning. Now, there is one difficulty to which we come soon, and that is this. It is generally admitted that the just things are noble. And if this is so, she concludes, then just degrading punishment is noble. But this is not granted by the many, because they would say degrading punishment for a man who deserves it is just, but it's not noble. Nothing to be proud of, nothing to admire. It may be noble to punish him, the act of punishment, but the receiving of punishment, that cannot be noble. That is the common view, and is, by the way, also stated by Aristotle, I think, in his Rhetoric. And now this leads to a broader discussion in 860 C, which we should turn now. So we may begin here. Page 223, top.
Athenian. Then let us look again at our own view and see how far it is consistent in this respect. Cleinias. What kind of consistency, and in respect of what do you mean? Athenian. I believe that I expressly stated in our previous discourse, or if I did not do it before, please assume that I now assert. Cleinias. What? Athenian. That all bad men are in all respects unwillingly bad, and this being so, our next statement must agree therewith. Cleinias. What statement do you mean? Athenian. This, that the unjust man is indeed bad, but the bad man is unwillingly bad. But it is illogical to suppose that a willing deed is done unwillingly. Therefore, he that commits an unjust act does so unwillingly in the opinion of him who assumes that injustice is involuntary, a conclusion which I also must now allow. For I agree that all men do unjust acts unwillingly. So since I hold this view, and do not share the opinion of those who, through contentiousness or arrogance, assert that while there are some who are unjust against their will, yet there are also many who are unjust willingly, how am I to prove consistent with my own statements? Suppose you two, Megillus and Cleinias, put this question to me. If this is the state of the case, stranger, What counsel do you give us in regard to legislating for the Magnesian state? Shall we legislate?
The Magnesian city is a city which they will found. The magnates were the people the members of the future colony. Yeah.
Shall we legislate or shall we not? Legislate by all means, I shall reply. Will you make a distinction then between voluntary and involuntary wrongdoings? And are we to enact heavier penalties for the crimes and wrongdoings that are voluntary and lighter penalties for the others? Or shall we enact equal penalties for all, on the view that there is no such thing as a voluntary act of injustice? Cleinias, what you say, stranger, is quite right. So what use are we to make of our present arguments? Athenian, a very proper question. The use we shall make of them to begin with is this. Cleinias, what? Athenian, let us recall how a moment ago we rightly stated that in regard to justice, we are suffering from the greatest confusion and inconsistency. Grasping this fact, let us again question ourselves. As to our perplexity about these matters, since we have neither got it clear nor defined the point of difference between those two kinds of wrongdoing, voluntary and involuntary, which are treated as legally distinct in every state by every legislator who has ever yet appeared. As to this, is the statement we recently made to stand, like a divine oracle, as a mere ex cathedra statement, unsupported by any proof, and to serve as a kind of master enactment. That is impossible, and before we legislate, we are bound first to make it clear somehow that these wrongdoings are twofold, and wherein their difference consists, in order that when we impose the penalty on either kind, everyone may follow our rules and be able to form some judgment regarding the suitability or otherwise of our enactments. Cleinias, what you say, stranger, appears to us to be excellent. We ought to do one of two things: either not assert that all unjust acts are involuntary, or else make our distinctions first, then prove the correctness of that assertion. Athenian, of these alternatives, the first is to me quite intolerable, namely, to assert what I hold to be the truth, for that would be neither a lawful thing, nor a pious.
Yeah.
Nor, yeah.
He had to say something different from what he thinks.
Namely, not to assert what I hold to be the truth.
Yeah.
For that would be neither a lawful thing to do, nor a pious. But as to the question how such acts are twofold, if the difference does not lie in that between the voluntary and the involuntary, then we must try to explain it by means of some other distinction. Cleinias, well, certainly, stranger, about this matter there is no other plan we can possibly adopt.
Now let us think for a moment what this means. How can the Athenians say that all unjust actions, all injustice, all vice is involuntary? Now, if he holds with Socrates that virtue is knowledge, then all vice is ignorance. And ignorance, what you do from ignorance, you do involuntarily, ultimately. And therefore that follows. But on the other hand, it is clear, even if this argument is correct, in one way or the other we have to make a distinction between voluntary crimes and involuntary crimes. We'll say between voluntary homicide and involuntary homicide. That is the difficulty. And as for this point which he mentions here, that it would be neither lawful nor pious for him not to say the truth which he knows, And this, of course, leads to the question, does not the Athenian stranger, does not Socrates from time to time say things which he does not believe? Is there not such a thing as a noble lie? And is there not even a discussion of this question, what is worse, the involuntary or the voluntary, say, liar? That is in one of the dialogues Hippias that is discussed. And the answer given is that the voluntary liar, I mean, the man who knows that he lies, is better than the involuntary one. Just as a man who voluntarily makes mistakes in writing is a better writer, a better knower of letters than the man who makes involuntary slips in writing. So that is only an indication of that the problem remains on the Socratic basis even. And how does he get out of this difficulty? Very simply. All unjust actions are a kind of damages done to others. But not all damages done to others are unjust acts. For example, if someone say, but the just character of either the doing harm or the doing good. At any rate, doing damage is as such not punishable. It must have this peculiar character of being which is not defined. And now we turn to 863a. Yeah, the first speech of Plinius. Yeah.
Plinius, what you have said seems very reasonable, but we should be glad to hear a still clearer statement respecting the difference between injury and injustice, and how the distinction between the voluntary and the involuntary applies in these cases. Athenian, I must endeavor to do as you bid me and explain the matter. No doubt, in conversing with one another, you say and hear said, at least thus much about the soul, that one element in its nature, be it affection or part, is passion, which is
thymos, yeah. You know that from the Republic.
Is thymos, which is an inbred quality of a conscientious and pugnacious kind, and one that overturns many things by its irrational force. Cleinias, of course. Moreover, we distinguish pleasure from thymos, and we assert that its mastering power is of an opposite kind, since it affects all that its intention desires by a mixture of persuasion and deceit. Cleinias, exactly. Athenian, nor would it be untrue to say that the third cause of sins is ignorance. This cause, however, the lawgiver would do well to subdivide into two, counting ignorance in its simple form to be the cause of minor sins, and in its double form, where the folly is due to the man being gripped not only by ignorance, but also by a conceit of wisdom, as though he had full knowledge of things he knows nothing at all about, counting this to be the cause of great and brutal sins, when it is joined with strength and might, but the cause of childish and senile sins, when it is joined with weakness. And these last he will count as sins, and he will ordain laws as for sinners, but laws that will be above all others of the most mild and merciful kind. Cleinias, that is reasonable. Athenian, and pretty well everyone speaks of one man being superior, another inferior, to pleasure or to thymos, and they are so. Cleinias, most certainly. Athenian, But we have never heard it said that one man is superior and another inferior to ignorance. Cleinias, quite true. Athenian, and we assert that all these things urge each man often to go counter to the actual bent of his own inclination. Cleinias, very frequently. Athenian, I will define for you clearly and without complication my notion of justice and injustice. The domination of thumos and fear and pleasure and pain and envies and desires in the soul, whether they do any injury or not, I turn...
Whether they do inflict damage or not.
Whether they inflict
because
damage.
Injury might remind us of injustice. Yeah?
I term generally injustice.
So that we have the distinction made now. The tyranny of the passions, that is injustice. And this tyranny is, in what sense is this? It is not the same as ignorance, it seems, but it is something involuntary. You remember the comparison of men, of most men, most of the time at least, to puppets, to playthings of the gods. You know, they are not, that is the same. They are dragged and pulled in different directions, and therefore they cannot be held responsible to that extent. But of course the law, simply by being there and by being enforced, acts also as such a dragging or pulling agent, and therefore the law has there is no difficulty regarding laws. Yes?
But the belief in the highest good, whatsoever...
Yeah, the opinion of the best. Yes?
But the opinion of the best, in whatsoever way either states or individuals think they can attain it, if this prevails in their souls and regulates every man, even if some damage be done, we must assert that everything thus done is just, and that in each man, the part subject to this governance is also just and best for the whole life of mankind, although most men suppose that such damage is an involuntary injustice. But we are not now concerned with a verbal dispute. Since, however, it has been shown that there are three kinds of sinning, we must first of all recall these still more clearly to mind.
So let us stop here. So if a man is guided by opinion of the best and yet makes a mistake, makes a false judgment, this is not, as many say, an involuntary act, an involuntary injustice, but it is just. But one wonders, is this not a clear case of ignorance of the true logos if he makes a mistake? That's dark. Now we do not have to read the sequel. The point which he makes later on is a distinction very common up to the present day, that crimes committed through anger are involuntary, and crimes committed through desire or lust are voluntary. So a simple example is this. If a man has killed another man, and then if he pleads, I did it in anger, and perhaps he can even show it, then this is an attenuating circumstance. But if someone rapes a woman and say, I did it from lust, that is not an attenuating circumstance. Yeah? This is the view which Plato and of course also Aristotle maintains about these matters. So, now you see how little one gets out of this book, except a general edification or so, if one doesn't read it much more carefully, then we can do it now. I would like to say a few words about the 10th book, which we have to read much more closely next time, at least a few of these passages. He has spoken at the beginning of Book 9, the first verse of Book 9, if you will, this will appear, of course, only in the Greek, is dikai, which means lawsuits, trials, punishments, such things. This, the beginning of Book 9, is the only beginning of a book which is meaningful, by which I mean not such expressions like thereafter, or after having said or so. And the first book is the only other book which has a meaningful beginning, the word God. And there is a connection between God or gods and punishment of crimes. So he speaks first of crimes consisting in actions, Book 9, and then he turns to verbal injuries in Book 10. And in this connection he comes to, quite naturally, to blasphemy, and more particularly to people who say there are no gods, or if there are gods, they don't care for human beings, or if they care for human beings, they can be easily persuaded or bribed. And this is the chief content of Book 10. It is the first extensive demonstration of the existence of God which has come down to us. Xenophon's Memorabilia, of course, has also 2 chapters dealing with that, but they are much briefer than the statement here. Now, let me see which is the first, a few passages which we could at least read today. Yeah, now, though, of course, Clarius and Megillus never knew that there are such terrible people who say these kind of things, because such people do not exist in Crete and Sparta. But the Athenian knows them all too well. And now what do they say? Let us turn to 888 D7. Do you have it?
7?
880 D7, yeah.
I see.
Okay.
Athenian. Very true, O Megillus and Cleinias, but we have plunged unawares into a wondrous argument. Cleinias. What is it you mean? Athenian. That which most people account to be the most scientific of all arguments.
Yeah, not most people, with many. Yeah.
311.
3:11.
Yeah.
The most scientific of all arguments. Cleinias.
That's the wisest of all speeches. Yeah. Yes?
Explain more clearly. Athenian. It is stated by some that all things which are coming into existence, or have or will come into existence, do so partly by nature, partly by art, and partly owing to chance. Cleinias. Is it not a right statement? Athenian. It is likely to be sure that when men of science,
A wise man.
that what the wise men say is true. Anyhow, let us follow them up and consider what it is that the people in their camp really intend. Cleinias. By all means, let us do so. Athenian. It is evident, they assert, that the greatest and most beautiful things are the work of nature and of chance, and the lesser things that of art. For art receives from nature the great and primary products as existing, and itself molds and shapes all the smaller ones, which we commonly call artificial. Cleinias. How do you mean? Athenian. I will explain it more clearly. Fire and water and earth and air, They say all exist by nature and chance, none of them by art, and by means of these, which are wholly inanimate, the bodies which come next, so those, namely, of the earth, sun, moon, and stars, have been brought into existence. It is by chance all these elements move by the interplay of their respective forces, and according as they meet together and combine fittingly, hot with cold, dry with moist, soft with hard, and all such necessary mixtures as result from the chance combination of these opposites. In this way, and by these means, they have brought into being the whole heaven, and all that is in heaven, and all the animals too, and plants. After that, all the seasons had arisen from these elements, and all this they assert, not owing to reason, nor
to intellect,
not owing to intellect,
yeah.
nor to any god or art, but owing, as we have said, to nature and chance.
Yeah, chance means here that there is no intention involved. Yeah, chance is not used in contradistinction to necessity, as you may have seen. Necessity is working in these, bring these elements together. Yes.
As a later product of these, art comes later, and it, being mortal itself and of mortal birth, begets later playthings, which share but little in truth, being images of a sort akin to the arts themselves, images such as painting begets, and music, and the arts which accompany these. Those arts which really produce something serious are such as share their effect with nature, like medicine, agriculture, and gymnastics.
You see, all which have to do with the body, yeah? Like medicine, obviously, and agriculture, simply follows the directions of nature, dependent on rain and so on, and gymnastics also the body, yes?
Politics too, as they say, shares to a small extent in nature, but mostly in art, and in like manner all legislation which is based on untrue assumptions is due not to nature but to art. Cleinias, what do you mean? Athenian, first statement, my dear sir, which these people make about the gods, is that they exist by art and not by nature, by certain legal conventions.
Yeah, by some laws, yeah.
By some laws, which differ from place to place, according as each tribe agreed when forming their laws. They assert, moreover, that there is one class of things beautiful by nature, and another class beautiful by convention, while as to things just, they do not exist at all by nature, but men are constantly in dispute about them, and continually altering them. And whatever alteration they make at any time is at that time authoritative, though it owes its existence to art and the laws, not in any way to nature. All these, my friends, are views which young people imbibe from men of science, both prose writers and poets, who maintain that the height of justice is to succeed by force, whence it comes that the young people are afflicted with a plague of impiety, as though the gods were not such as the law commands us to conceive them. And because of this, factions also arise, when these teachers attract them toward the life which is right according to nature, which consists in being master over the rest in reality, instead of being a slave to others.
Yes, so that is a sketch of the anti-Socratic view. Yeah? The first things are the lifeless bodies, out of which living bodies somehow come into being, and then human beings and the products of human beings, the arts and the conventions. The arts have a higher status than the conventions, and one convention is particularly important. These are the gods. They have no status whatever. They are merely by convention. And as for human life, we must distinguish the life corrected according to nature, and that is to be superior to others by successfully asserting that superiority, in contradistinction to being a slave to orders according to law. I mean, that is the conventional view, that one should be a slave to others, that one should serve others. And that is a clear opposition, and it is of course interesting to know that the Cretan, at least in the Spartan too, spoke very highly of being superior to others in battles. You remember that is being superior in war as a chief content of virtue. Naturally, they do not have this theoretical premises, but that is their business, how they can get to their law-abiding view from their premises. So, and now the Athenian must, of course, prove the existence of gods. And that is his first task. We can perhaps read a few more passages. Cleinias' speech in 890 because the Athenian is a great task, and the Athenian needs encouragement all the time to engage on the task. Yes?
Cleinias, certainly not, stranger. On the contrary, if persuasion can be applied in such matters, in even the smallest degree, no lawgiver who is of the slightest account must ever grow weary, but must, as they say, leave no stone unturned, to reinforce the ancient saying that gods exist.
No. They must become an assistant to the ancient law. Yeah. That is of some difficulty, but that is what we read here. Yeah. By the speech, one must come to the assistance of the old law. By the speech that there are gods. Yeah. Yes.
And all else that you recounted just now. And the law itself he must also defend, and art, as things which exist by nature, or by a cause not inferior to nature, since, according to right reason, they are the offspring of mind, even as you are now, as I think, asserting, and I agree with you. Athenian, what now, my most ardent Cleinias? Are not statements thus made to the masses difficult for us to keep up with an argument? And do they not also involve us in arguments portentously long?
Yeah, let us see. Yeah, in 891b, let us read only the beginning of this segment.
Athenian, most certainly it is, Megillus, and we must do as he says. For if the assertions mentioned had not been sown, broadcast well nigh over the whole world of men, there would have been no need of counter-arguments to defend the existence of the gods. But as it is, they are necessary. For when the greatest laws are being destroyed by wicked men, who is more bound to come to their rescue than the lawgiver? Megillus, no one. Athenian, come now, Cleinias. Do you also answer me again? For you, too, must take a hand in the argument. It appears that the person who makes these statements holds fire, water, earth, and air to be the first of all things, and that it is precisely to these things that he gives the name of nature, while soul, he asserts, to be a later product therefrom. Probably, indeed, he does not merely appear to do this, but actually makes it clear to us in his account. Cleinias, certainly. Athenian, can it be then, in heaven's name, that now we have discovered, as it were, a very fountainhead of irrational opinion in all the men who have ever yet handled physical investigations?
Yeah, that is a very strong statement, is it not? That all people who have touched investigations regarding nature held this view that there are no gods. And that is contrary to the wording of many traditions regarding the so-called pre-Socratics. But this is the way in which the Athenian presents it here. Yes?
Consider and examine each statement, for it is a matter of no small importance if it can be shown that those who handle impious arguments and lead others after them employ their arguments not only ill, but erroneously. And this seems to me to be the state of affairs. Finally, well said, but try to explain therein wherein the error lies.
Yeah, now we must stop here. And the argument which the Athenian uses is to show, of course, as it was suggested by Cleinias, that the soul is prior to the body. And that means especially this primacy of the soul is shown especially with regard to the heavenly bodies, sun, moon, and stars. These beings what is characteristic of the soul is self-motion. Now, when you look at the heavenly bodies, you see you don't see anyone or anything pushing or pulling them. They move on their own. They are living beings. They are gods. By the way, the same view is underlying, of course, and contradicted there, the account of creation, the first chapter of Genesis. When you see the order of created things, the living beings, which we would regard as living beings, come after sun, moon, and star. And why? Because the living beings, even the smallest louse, is superior in dignity to sun, moon, and stars, which are lifeless bodies. And so Plato naturally takes the opposite side. But in the context of the argument, he doesn't prove, of course, that there are gods of the polis, Zeus, Athene, and so on, or Hera, but the cosmic gods. But even this is complicated by the fact that he asserts, we will see that next time if we can do that there must be two souls or two kinds of soul. Good ones, responsible for order, and bad ones, responsible for disorder, because there is also disorder in the world. So that the primacy of the soul is endangered by the bad souls, or rather there might be a way in which the non-soul is coeval with the soul and brings in the X responsible for disorder. Well, we must see that next time. Look, last time at a few selected passages from books 8 and 9. And we should read today a few passages, what at least at first glance seem to be the most important passages, in books 10 and 12, so that we complete, in a way, the reading of the laws. I stress the words "in a way." Now, Book 10 is surely a high point of the work, and this for two reasons. The first word of the laws is God, and Book 10 contains a demonstration of the existence of gods. something which has hitherto been presupposed is now in a way demonstrated. And the second reason why Book 10 is so especially important is this. The character in the laws is the Athenian stranger, taking the place of Socrates. Now, Book 10 deals with the subject of God or gods in the context of punishment for impiety. And Socrates was condemned to death on the ground of impiety. So the whole question of Socrates' guilt or innocence comes up in the mind of the reader, and surely also in the mind of the writer in Book 10. So we will read a few passages from Book 10 about that. Now, there are three impious assertions which are discussed here. The first, that there are no gods at all. The second, that there are gods, but they don't care for human beings. And the third, that there are gods and they care for human beings, but they are not just. They can be bribed by prayers or sacrifices to reward the unjust and to punish the just. Of these three impious assertions, the first is obviously the most important. It's a proof of the existence of gods altogether. And naturally, we must know, in a way, what a god is, otherwise it is hard to prove its existence. But we can leave it at saying, the question is not explicitly raised here, that by God is understood a living being, and more specifically, a deathless being. Now, as for the proof, which appears in the form of a refutation of the atheists, they say the primary things are bodies, lifeless bodies, and that by chance or necessity, which two words have here the same meaning, heaven and the earth come into being, and so also animals and plants. Still more derivative than animals and plants, much more derivative, are the arts, human inventions. Even more derivative, even weaker, are laws. Now, the gods who are not are in a manner by virtue of laws, by virtue of agreements or conventions. And these laws or conventions differ from tribe to tribe. But everywhere there is this convention to the effect that there are gods. But the conventions differ as to the qualities and attributes of the gods. And now, this much I think we have even read last time, and let us now turn to the sequel. That is 891 B1. Do you have it? Mm-hmm. A speech of the Athenian. Yeah.
Athenian. Most certainly it is, Megillus, and we must do as he says. For if the assertions mentioned had not been sown broadcast well nigh over the whole world of men, there would have been no need of counter-arguments to defend the existence of the gods. But as it is, they are necessary. For when the greatest laws are being destroyed by wicked men, who is more bound to come to their rescue than the lawgiver?
So now, you see here there is obviously a difference. The lawgiver comes to the defense of the greatest laws. These greatest laws antedate the action of the lawgiver. And these greatest laws are the laws implying that the gods exist. Yes?
McGillis, no one. Athenian, come now, Cleinias, do you also answer me again? For you too must take a hand in the argument. It appears that the person who makes these statements holds fire, water, earth, and air to be the first of all things, and that it is precisely to these things that he gives the name of nature, while soul he asserts to be a later product therefrom. Probably, indeed, he does not merely appear to do this, but actually makes it clear to us in his account. Cleinias, certainly. Athenian, can it be then in heaven's name that
By Zeus.
by Zeus, that now we have discovered, as it were, a very fountainhead of irrational opinion in all the men who have ever yet handled physical investigations?
You see, that is a very important statement. All men who have hitherto investigated or made inquiries regarding nature have held this most impious view. In the language of today, all pre-Socratic philosophers were atheists. Of course, that is what the Athenian stranger says to the Cretan and Spartan, and to what extent Plato himself would say that is another question. Yes?
Consider and examine each statement, for it is a matter of no small importance if it can be shown that those who handle impious arguments and lead others after them employ their arguments not only ill but erroneously, and this seems to me to be the state of affairs. Cleinias, well said, but try to explain wherein the error lies. Athenian, we shall probably have to handle rather an unusual argument. Cleinias, we must not shrink, stranger. You think I perceive that we shall be traversing alien ground, outside legislation, if we handle such arguments. But if there is no other way in which it is possible for us to speak in concert with the truth, as now legally declared, except this way, then in this way, my good sir, we must speak. Athenian, it appears then that I may at once proceed with an argument that is somewhat unusual. It is this: that which is the first cause of becoming and perishing of all things, this is declared by the arguments which have produced the soul of the impious to be not first, but generated later, and that which is the later to be the earlier. And because of this, they have fallen into error regarding the real nature of divine existence.
It's clear, yeah. If bodies are simply first, then the gods are of very low rank, in the best case. In the best case, they could be products, say, of the elements. Of course, then also perishable, naturally. Yes?
Cleinias, I do not yet understand. Athenian, as regards the soul, my comrade, nearly all men appear to be ignorant of its real nature and its potency, and ignorant not only of other facts about it, but of its origin especially. How that it is one of the first existences, and prior to all bodies, and that it more than anything else is what governs all the changes and modifications of bodies. And if this is really the state of the case, must not things which are akin to the soul be necessarily prior in origin to things which belong to body, seeing that soul is older than body?
So in other words, he wishes to turn around the argument against these atheists. The primary is not body, but soul. That is fundamentally the demonstration of the existence of God. Of what further premises are implied, we shall see soon. Yes?
Cleinias, necessarily. Athenian, then opinion and reflection and thought and art and law will be prior to things hard and soft and heavy and light. And further, the works and actions that are great and primary will be those of art, while those that are natural and nature itself, which they wrongly call by this name, will be secondary and will derive their origin from art, and reason. Cleinias, how are they wrong? Athenian, by nature, they intend to indicate the production of things primary.
How does it say?
By nature, that is, in quotation,
Yeah.
they intend to indicate production of things primary.
No, the genesis, the coming to being, connected with the first things, I believe he means. It's a connection going on in connection with the first things, yes.
But if soul shall be shown to have been introduced first, not fire or air, but soul first and foremost, it would most truly be described as a superlatively natural existence. Born first?
I beg your pardon.
No, this is translation said, if soul shall be shown to have been produced first, but that's the text.
If the soul shall have been shown to have come into being first, not fire or air, but soul first and foremost, it would most truly be described as a superlatively natural existence.
Namely, because of what is primary is superlatively natural. And then the soul, rather than elements or body, would be natural. Yes.
Such is the state of the case, provided that one can prove that soul is older than body, but not otherwise. Cleinias, most true. Athenian, shall we then, in the next place, address ourselves to the task of proving this? Cleinias, certainly. Athenian, let us guard against a wholly deceitful argument, lest haply it seduce us who are old with its spacious youthfulness, and then elude us and make us a laughing stock, so we get the reputation of missing even little things while aiming at big things. Consider then, suppose that we three had to cross a river that was in violent flood, and that I, being the youngest of the party, and having often had experience of currents, were to suggest that the proper course is for me to make an attempt first by myself, leaving you two in safety, to see whether it is possible for you older men also to cross, or how the matter stands. And then, if the river proved to be clearly fordable, I were to call you, and by my experience help you across, while if it proved impassable for such as you, in that case the risk should be wholly mine. Such a suggestion on my part would have sounded reasonable. So too in the present instance. The argument now in front of us is too violent and probably impassable for such strength as you possess. So, lest it make you faint and dizzy as it rushes past and poses you with questions you are unused to answering, and thus causes an unpleasing lack of shapeliness and seemliness, I think that I ought now to act in the way described, question myself first, while you remain listening in safety, and then return answer to myself, and in this way proceed through the whole argument until it has discussed in full the subject of soul, and demonstrated that soul is prior to body. Cleinias, your suggestion, stranger, we think excellent. So do as you suggest.
So in other words, what we will hear now is a dialogue, but a dialogue between the Athenian and an absent atheist, and not with Cleinias or Megillus, of course. And in this dialogue he proves the primacy of the soul by an argument along these lines. The soul, the principle of life, is self-moving, and bodily emotions are as such caused by others. Now there is the self-moving is prior to the other kinds of motions, and in this sense the soul is primary. The soul is, as it is put, the arche, the initiating beginning of every motion, and it is the most venerable, the oldest and best of all changes. Soul is the first coming to being and motion of everything that is, that has been, and that will be. And the conclusion from all this is the soul has come into being prior to the body, that we find in 896. Perhaps if you read this speech of the Athenian, which begins shortly before 896 C.
Athenian. Truly and finally, then, it would be a most veracious and complete statement to say that we find soul to be prior to body, and body secondary and posterior, soul governing and body being governed according to the ordinance of nature.
Yeah, according to nature, meaning it may very well happen against nature, say in a human being, that the body rules the soul, but that is an unnatural, a violent condition. Yeah? And now let us see the sequel, which is of great importance for the argument of the whole, also for the later argument in Book 10. Yes?
Cleinias, yes, most veracious. Athenian. We recollect, of course, that we previously agreed that if soul could be shown to be older than body, then the things of soul also will be older than those of body. Cleinias. Certainly we do. Athenian. Moods and dispositions and wishes and calculations and true opinions and considerations and memories will be prior to bodily length, breadth, depth, strength, if soul is prior to body. Cleinias. Necessarily. Athenian. Must we then necessarily agree, in the next place, that soul is the cause of things good and bad, fair and foul, just and unjust, and all the opposites, if we are to assume it is to be the cause of all things? Cleinias. Of course we must. Athenian. And as soul thus controls and indwells in all things, everywhere, that are moved, must we not necessarily affirm that it controls heaven also? Cleinias. Yes. Athenian. One soul is it, or several? I will answer for you. Several. Anyhow, let us assume not less than two. The beneficent soul, and that which is capable of effecting results of the opposite kind.
Namely, a non-beneficent soul. Yeah? Yes.
No, a maleficent soul.
Maleficent soul.
Cleinias, you are perfectly right.
Yeah. Now let us stop here for a moment. That is a passage which is very famous and which has been brought together with Parsiism, Ormuz and Ahriman, and other kinds of things. Perhaps it has something to do with that, because Xenophon in his Education of Cyrus mentions such a doctrine of two souls, a good and a bad soul, and that plays in Persia. But the main point, it occurs nowhere else in this form in Plato. But Plato cannot have said it for nothing. There must be a reason for that. Now, if the soul is the cause of everything, there must be two souls, a good one and a bad one. This conclusion is tacitly dropped in the sequel. And that means perhaps also the premise is tacitly dropped. Namely, that the soul is a cause of everything. There must be two causes of everything, the soul and X. And that X is not determined here. This is discussed in the Platonic works elsewhere, but not in the laws. But why does he make this discussion here? Now, I believe we have to consider the following disjunction. If the soul is the cause of everything, there is a bad soul. There are bad souls, and there may therefore be bad gods. That's one possibility. The alternative is the soul is not the cause of all things. There is also a non-divine cause of disorder of various kinds, of which human injustice is one and perhaps the most important part. But then, if there is such another cause, then the gods surely lack omnipotence. They cannot control this other cause. So now the argument regarding providence, which follows in this book, in Book 10, is based on this argument, that the gods are good and omnipotent. And this argument, I believe, is called into question by this brief discussion of the allusion to a bad soul. Now let us see what we read next. Yep. In 899b, at the beginning, there's a speech of the Athenian.
Athenian. Concerning all the stars and the moon, and concerning the years and months and all seasons, what other account shall we give than this very same, namely, that inasmuch as it has been shown that they are all caused by one or more souls, which are good, also with all goodness, we shall declare these souls to be God, whether it be that they order the whole heaven by residing in bodies as living creatures, or whatever the mode and method. Is there any man that agrees with this view who will stand hearing it denied that all things are full of gods? Cleinias. There is not a man, stranger, so wrong-headed as that.
Yeah. So in other words, the gods whose existence has been proven in one way or the other are cosmic gods, not the gods of the Olympus, the gods worshipped by the city. Yeah, that is, I think, the point we must keep in mind. And that is, of course, of crucial importance for what the law prescribes. If someone would question the existence of Zeus or Hera, this is not forbidden by this law, or by this implied law, because what we have proven is only the existence of the cosmic gods. And accordingly, Socrates, if he has not believed in Zeus or Hera, would be guilty of the crime of impiety. Yeah, sure.
The disjunction you stated between souls, two kinds of souls, and souls of other principle has to be side in favor of souls of other kind of principle. And that doesn't offer the providential care, so it doesn't also deal with the possibility of retributive justice. Isn't that with the premise of the whole line?
I see. What was the second point? I understood it first.
Does it deal with the possibility of punitive justice? That is, the possibility of punishing men for wrongdoing voluntarily or something like that?
Well, since retributive justice is a part of divine providence, if divine providence becomes questionable, retributive justice becomes questionable, unless retributive justice, is, so to speak, automatic. Meaning that evil deeds and what they do to the doer will have their consequences on the doer in infinitum. That, of course, is not excluded. Yes.
then about the cosmic gods.
Yeah.
Then about Olympic gods, it is true. You have to believe in them or that until time.
Yeah, that is not explicitly said.
But what about the so-called domestic finance, these gods? They were more than like spirits, or they were regarded as gods. You know, the gods of domestic cults in almost in every house.
Yeah, well, what do you mean? Private shrines of this kind of thing?
Yeah, but they were the private, not the private in a way that they were in different houses, in different.
You know, that is forbidden. That will be made clear. There will be no private sectarianism, so to speak. There will be only the worship sanctioned by the city. Surely the city will not explicitly say only the cosmic gods can be worshipped and the traditional Olympian gods may not be worshipped. It will not say that. But for criminal prosecution, which lies in the hands not of the indiscriminate demons, but of the cream of the population, they will of course consider them. We must for this purpose read the law regarding impiety, which comes very soon. Yes.
I was wondering what you make of the slight inconsistency between having the younger man prove to the older man about the things. It's clear that the proof depends on the principle that the older men are more venerable.
Yeah, the word older occurs quite frequently in this section. The soul is older than the body. But this older is obviously somewhat different than that Megillus and Cleinias are older than the Athenians. And it underlines it, that old age as such has here no particular privilege.
Yeah, it's somehow that the less venerable becomes the leader.
Yeah, but in another sense, he is of course more venerable because he is wiser. There are other things here involved, but surely it is striking what you all observed at once, that here the dialogue is conducted in the presence of Cleinias and Megillus, but not with them, because they would be wholly unable to be partners of it. And therefore, what kind of knowledge of the gods they have or acquire, that you can easily see.
One could also ask, what is that dangerous stream that they're crossing?
Unbelief, I suppose, would be the simplest explanation.
Well, I'm not so sure. What do you mean that somehow the Athenian stranger is more immune to unbelief than Megillus and Cleinias?
Yeah, because he understands, Cleinias and Megillus believe in gods, just as their fathers and grandfathers and so on before them had believed that. And they have never seriously thought about that. And now, outside of Crete and Sparta, in such places as Athens, there were people like Anaxagoras and so on, who questioned these beliefs. And therefore the Athenian is familiar with it. He has given thought to these difficulties, and therefore his belief can be more rational than the beliefs of Cleinias and Megillus. And he, as it were, carries them on his back into that higher region of rational belief. Whether that is in fact possible to carry people in this way, that is a question. which is perhaps not even a question. Yeah. Now, let us perhaps consider the law, which is of Strauss light of the whole thing, that comes later in 974. 70.
Athenian. After the prelude,
Yeah, the prelude, the whole argument proving the existence of the gods, is the prelude to the law regarding impiety. Yes?
it will be proper for us to have a statement of a kind suitable to serve as the law's interpreter, forewarning all the impious to quit their ways for those of piety. For those who disobey, this shall be the law concerning impiety. If anyone commits impiety, either by word or deed, he that meets with him shall defend the law by informing the magistrates. And the first magistrates who hear of it shall bring the man up before the court, appointed to decide such cases as the laws direct. And if any magistrate, on hearing of the matter, fail to do this, he himself shall be liable to a charge of impiety, at the hands of him who wishes to punish him on behalf of the laws. And if a man be convicted, the court shall assess one penalty for each separate act of impiety. Imprisonment shall be imposed in every case, and since there are 3 prisons in the state, namely one public prison near the market for most cases, to secure the persons of the average criminals, a second situated near the assembly room of the officials who hold nightly assemblies.
So this is a Nocturnal Council, the highest magistracy in the city, whose function is described more fully later. Yes.
And named the Reformatory, and a third situated in the middle of the country in the wildest and loneliest spot possible, and named after retribution. And since men are involved in impiety from the 3 causes which we have described,
Namely, atheism, denial of providence, denial of the gods being just in retributing justice and injustice. Yes?
and from each such cause 2 forms of impiety result. Consequently, those who sin in respect of religion fall into 6 classes, which require to be distinguished as needing penalties that are neither equal nor similar. For while those who, though they utterly disbelieve in the existence of God, possess by nature a just character, both hate the evil, and because of their dislike of injustice are incapable of being induced to commit unjust actions, and flee from unjust men, and love the just, on the other hand, those...
This is one kind. The atheists, but just men. Yeah? One kind. Now what's the other?
On the other hand, those who, besides holding that the world is empty of gods, are afflicted by incontinence in respect of pleasures and pains, and possess also powerful memories and sharp wits, though both these classes share alike in the disease of atheism, yet in respect of the amount of ruin they bring on other people, the latter class would work more and the former less of evil. For where...
So the same could, of course, also apply the same distinction to the other 2 heretics. Say those who deny providence but are honest men, and those who deny divine justice but are honest men. Yeah? Yes.
For whereas the one class will be quite frank in its language about the gods and about sacrifices and oaths, and by ridiculing other people will probably convert others to its view, unless it meets with punishment. The other class, while holding the same opinions as the former, yet being specially gifted by nature, and being full of craft and guile, is the class out of which are manufactured many diviners and experts in all manner of jugglery, and from it, too, there spring sometimes tyrants and demagogues and generals, and those who plot by means of peculiar mystic rites of their own, and devices of those who are called sophists. Of these there may be many kinds, But those which call for legislation are two, of which the ironic kind commit sins that deserve not one death only, or two, while the other kind requires both admonition and imprisonment. Likewise also, the belief that the gods are neglectful breeds two other kinds of impiety, and the belief in their being open to bribes, other two. These kinds, being thus distinguished, those criminals who suffer from folly, being devoid of evil disposition and character, shall be placed by the judge according to law in the reformatory for a period of not less than 5 years, during which time no other of the citizens shall hold intercourse with them, save only those who take part in the nocturnal assembly, and they shall company with them to minister to their souls salvation by admonition. And when the period of their incarceration has expired, if any of them seems to be reformed, he shall dwell with those who are reformed. But if not, and if he be convicted again on a like charge, he shall be punished by death. But as to those who have become like ravening beasts, and who, besides holding that the gods are negligent or open to bribes, despise men, charming the souls of many of the living, and claiming that they charm the souls of the dead, and promising to persuade the gods by bewitching them, as it were, with sacrifices, prayers, and incantations, and who try thus to wreck utterly not only individuals, but whole families and states for the sake of money. And if any of these men be pronounced guilty, the court shall order him to be imprisoned according to law in the mid-county jail, and shall order that no free man shall approach such criminals at any time, and that they shall receive from the servants a ration of food as fixed by the law wardens. And he that dies shall be cast outside the borders without burial. And if any free man assist in burying him, he shall be liable to a charge of impiety at the hands of anyone who chooses to prosecute. And if the dead man leaves children fit for citizenship, the guardians of orphans shall take them also under their charge from the day of their father's conviction, just as much as any other orphans.
Yeah, no, let us stop here. So that is a law regarding impiety. Now, under which category could Socrates possibly fall? He, of course, would belong, in the worst case, to the just people. That's clear. And then to the just people. And the second, would he be full of parrhesia, of the willingness to say everything and ridicule other people who sacrifice and swear oaths? This is one group, yeah? That's one group which is full of such frankness and ridicules people who sacrifice and pray. We have an example of that in Xenophon's Memorabilia, Aristodemus, in Book 1, Chapter 4. He was a pupil of Socrates, and he did not sacrifice and pray, and ridiculed people who did, and Socrates tried to change him. Some of you may remember that. That's one class. And the other class are those gifted crooks, like Alcibiades and sophists and demagogues and so on. Now, Socrates surely wouldn't belong to the second class, but would he belong to the first class, to those who ridicule other people for their piety? I think one can say no. And then he later makes this distinction. One class is ironical, and they deserve not only one and not only two deaths. It's not further developed, meaning infinitely many deaths. And the other deserve admonition and prison. Now, to which class would Socrates belong, assuming that he did not believe in the gods? It's very hard to say. The ironic man would be the man who dissembles And the dissembler would precisely not ridicule other people and therefore makes them unwilling to continue with the ritual. Yes?
There's one prophet, the law begins by saying only men who bring the Lord word and deed, some do it, but the good, some who don't really be taught, so you will never get taught. So the ironic is no provision to catch the ironic.
Yes, but that is a difficulty in all penal law, in which the legislator can never state. If the legislator would state, he who steals must pay 10 times the amount of the worth of the stolen thing, will pay that, then he says an untruth. He would have to add, if he is caught, which the legislator cannot do for sheer shame. Pardon? Yeah. Yeah, but perhaps this is meant when he speaks of the ironical type, which deserves not one and not is worthy of not one and not two deaths, but will not be executed because of lack of evidence. Yeah. So at any rate, the law is there much milder. Even in the worst case, he would get 5 years prison and not death. The judgment. Say a lawyer who accepts cases, the defense of people whom he knows to be criminals, he will be punished much more severely in the Cretan city than the just atheist. Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, there is a remarkable statement. People call this Inquisition, but it is very different from Inquisition. And the conversation with this Nocturnal Council, that would be friendly conversations in this sophronisterion, as it is called, the place for making people more moderate, more reasonable, more sensible. And here you can say it a reformatory if you do not think of the actual reformatories, but of what a reformatory could or should be. And that would be not the worst what could happen to a man. Yes.
It sounds like a compulsory graduate school of theology.
Yeah, but theology is an ambiguous term. Does it mean rational or revealed theology? Pardon? No, revealed theology is by definition not rational.
Because I don't want to be biased.
Yeah, well, you have a better reason, because the term philosophy occurs, as far as I can see, only twice in this very lengthy work, and surely not Book 10. Yeah.
What is the meaning of the providence? What would it mean to talk about a man who believed in the gods but did not believe in divine providence?
The Epicureans are a famous example. The gods live in some places here between the worlds in the Mundia, and they live in perfect bliss and don't care for men. In a certain way, like the Olympian gods.
Okay, I guess that would be like the gods of the, yeah.
Yes. And now, Dr. Castello?
I'm not sure that I correctly, but isn't the distinction really between the two kinds of classes of impiety really not one said it's not a distinction between impiety at all, but
Pardon?
couldn't one say that the distinction really has not to do with impiety at all, but with other virtues? And that the more severely punished are in a way the unjust. Yes, in fact, like the very first class, the man who is just
Yeah, so you mean, in other words, impiety would seem to mean primarily criminality in every respect. And that is tacitly questioned here. Yeah, that's true. But that played, of course, in that modern moment, when in the 17th, 18th century, in the course of which morality was regarded as the highest tribunal, before which even religion would have to justify itself. Something of this is already here. Something like this. But the classic example in modern times was Spinoza, who was regarded as an absolutely terrible unbeliever, but at the same time a virtuous man. Didn't steal silver spoons, paid his taxes and whatever else. And so, if you have ever done any reading in the 17th, 18th century, you must have come across this kind of thing. It's still effective today, I believe.
Nietzsche said when one gets, when one abandons the God, one feels more stronger.
One,
If one abandons
the gods, yes.
then one flees to morality.
Yeah.
This is your only refuge, and for those who want to have a refuge.
Yeah, that is a long question. And one could, just for the sake of argument, say that Nietzsche himself refutes his thesis, that he asserts God is dead. For this reason, he says morality is dead. So, that is a long question. But to come back to the Athenian stranger, I think it is clear how amazingly liberal he is. And the ambiguity here is that on the one hand we have here the mocker in the sense of the second psalm. If mocking is a term used in the English translation, which I don't know, is mocker the term? No, in the second psalm, the seed of the mockers. At any rate, the mockers, and on the other hand, the ironical man, who in the original sense of ironical, who of course would not mock, but a dissembler. This ambiguity is here, is a key, I think, to the whole thing. So we have to consider one more passage in Book 12, and the last one, and beginning in 963, at the very beginning. And here the Athenian stranger leads up to the demand for a firm anchor for the whole edifice. And this can only be a group of men of the greatest possible knowledge, citizens much, but still a man of the greatest possible knowledge. And this is what he calls the Nocturnal Council, to which he had already referred in Book 10, in the passage which we have read. Now, what are these men of the Nocturnal Council supposed to do, apart from their practical, judicial, and legislative functions? If you will read that, please.
Plinius. Then, stranger, was not the view we stated long ago the right one? We said that all our laws must always aim at one single object, which, as we agreed, is quite rightly named virtue. Athenian. Yes. Plinius. And we stated that virtue consists of four things. Athenian. Certainly. And that the chief of all four is reason.
The intellect, yes.
At which the other three, as well as everything else, should aim. Athenian. You follow us admirably, Plinius, and now follow us in what comes next. In the case of the pilot, the doctor, and the general, reason is directed, as we said, towards the object of aim, which is proper in each case. And now we are at the point of examining reason in the case of a statesman, and addressing it as a man, we shall question it thus. O admirable sir, what is your aim? Medical reason is able to state clearly the one object at which it aims. So, will you be unable to state your one object, you who are superior, as perhaps you will say to all the wise? Can you too, Megillus and Plinius, define that object on his behalf, and tell me what you say it is, just as I, on behalf of many others, define their objects for you? Plinius, we are totally unable to do so. Athenian, well then, can you declare that we need zeal in discerning both the object itself as a whole and the forms it assumes? Plinius, illustrate what you mean by the forms you speak of. Athenian, for example, when we said that there are 4 forms of virtue, obviously, since there are 4, we must assert that each is a separate one. Plinius, certainly. And yet we call them all by one name. We assert that courage is virtue, and wisdom is virtue, and the other 2 likewise, as though they were really not a plurality, but solely this one thing, virtue. Plinius, very true. Now it is not hard to explain wherein these 2 and the rest differ from one another, and how they have got 2 names. But to explain why we have given the one named virtue to both of them and to the rest is no longer an easy matter. Plinius, how do you mean? Athenian, it is not hard to make clear my meaning. Let one of us adopt the role of questioner, the other of answerer. Plinius, in what way? Athenian, do you ask me this question, why? When, calling both the 2 by the single name of virtue, did we again speak of them as 2, courage and wisdom? Then I shall tell you the reason, which is that the one of them has to do with fear, namely courage, in which beasts also share, and the characters of very young children, for a courageous soul comes into existence naturally and without reasoning. But without reasoning, there never yet came into existence, and there does not, nor ever will exist, a soul that is wise and rational, it being a distinct kind. Plinius, that is true. Athenian, wherein they differ and are 2, you have now learned from my reply. So do you in turn inform me how it is that they are one and identical. Imagine you are also going to tell me how it is that though 4, they are yet one. And then, after you have shown me how they are one, do you again ask me how they are 4? And after that, let us inquire regarding the person who has full knowledge of any objects which possess both a name and a definition, whether he ought to know the name only, and not know the definition, or whether it is not a shameful thing for a man worth anything to be ignorant of all these points in regard to matters of surpassing beauty and importance. Plinius, it would certainly seem to be so. Athenian, for the lawgiver and the law warden, and for him who thinks he surpasses all men in virtue, and who has won prizes for just such qualities, is there anything more important than these very qualities with which we are now dealing, courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom? Plinius, impossible. Athenian, in regard to these matters, is it not right that the interpreters, the teachers, the lawgivers, the wardens, as the wardens of the rest, in dealing with him that requires knowledge and information, or with him that requires punishment and reproof of his sin, should excel all others in the art of instructing him in the quality of vice and virtue, and exhibiting it fully? Or is some poet who comes into the state, or one who calls himself a trainer of youth, to be accounted evidently superior to him that has won prizes for all the virtues. In a state like that, there are no wardens who are competent both in word and deed, and possessed of a competent knowledge of virtue. Is it surprising, I ask, if such a state, all unwarded as it is, suffers the same fate as do many of the states which exist today? Cleinias: not at all, I should say. Athenian: well then, must we do what we now propose, or what? Must we contrive how our wardens shall have a more accurate grasp of virtue, both in word and deed, than the majority of men? For otherwise, how shall our state resemble a wise man's head and senses, on the ground that it possesses within itself a similar kind of wardenship? Cleinias: what is this resemblance we speak of, and wherein does it consist? Athenian: evidently, we are comparing the state itself to the skull, and the wardens, the younger ones, who are selected as the most intelligent and nimble in every part of their souls, are set, as it were, like the eyes, on the top of the head, and survey the state all round. And as they watch, they pass on their perceptions to the organs of memory, that is, they report to the elder wardens all that goes on in the state, while the old men, who are likened to the reason, make use of the young men as ministers and colleagues also in their councils, so that both these classes, by their cooperation, really effect the salvation of the whole state. Is this the way, or ought we to contrive some other? Should the state, do you think, have all its members equal, instead of having some more highly trained and educated? Cleinias: nay, my good sir, that were impossible. Athenian: we must proceed then to expound a type of education that is higher than the one previously described. Cleinias: I suppose so.
Perhaps would be more simple translation of what Cleinias argues. Now that is so here philosophy raises its ugly head in a slightly disguised way. This question, which is so familiar to you from the Protagoras and other dialogues, the question of the oneness and the manyness of the virtues, this is now entrusted to the highest magistracy in the city, the Nocturnal Council, and a much higher education than was hitherto explicitly discussed is needed in order to save the city. Now, the way in which the manyness of the virtues is discussed here is somewhat different from what is said in the other dialogues, insofar as courage is here taken simply as an wholly non-rational, as something with also beasts can have, contrary to what has been said by Socrates so often. And therefore the problem of virtue becomes very striking, that it consists of radically different things. The intellect on the one hand, and an irrational, quote, courage, unquote, on the other. And one would have to consider why the Athenian stranger uses this extreme formulation, which is not elsewhere used by Plato. So this is the first great subject with which the Nocturnal Council must concern itself. Virtue with a view to the fact that it is one and many. And then there is another subject which comes up a little bit later. We may begin in 966 C.
Athenian: and is not one of the fairest things the doctrine about the gods, which we expounded earnestly? You know both that they exist and what powers they manifestly possess, so far as a man is capable of learning these matters, so that while one should pardon the mass of citizens if they merely follow the letter of the law, one must exclude from office those who are eligible for wardenship, unless they labor to grasp all the proofs there are about the existence of gods. Such exclusion from office consists in refusing ever to choose as a law warden, or to number among those approved for excellence, a man who is not divine himself, nor has spent any labor over things divine. Cleinias, it is certainly just, as you say, that the man who is idle or incapable in respect of this subject should be strictly debarred from the ranks of the noble. Athenian, are we assured then that there are two causes among those we previously discussed which lead to faith in the gods? Cleinias, what two? Athenian, one is our dogma about the soul, that it is the most ancient and divine of all the things whose motion, when developed into becoming, provides an ever-flowing fount of being, and the other is our dogma concerning the ordering of the motion of the stars and all the other bodies under the control of reason, which has made a cosmos of the all. For no man that views these objects in no careless or amateurish way has ever proved so godless as not to be affected by them in a way just the opposite of that which most people expect.
Yeah, but most people expect that the study of astronomy would lead to atheism. But just the opposite is true, as you would explain the secret. But let us for one moment consider the two subjects in connection. The virtues, the one is manliness, and then the gods, which means the primacy of the soul compared with the body, and secondly, that the heavenly bodies are living beings, and therefore gods, guided by nous. Now, what is the connection between these two subject matters, these highest subject matters, according to the laws? Yeah, but all right, that one can say, you know, but there would not the question of the virtues, as stated before, lead to what is generally known as the doctrine of ideas? The word ideas, idea occurs, but not necessarily in the precise sense, in the technical sense. And here, but the virtues are either directed to or culminating in the nous, the intellect. And therefore, the highest theme should not be the virtues, but the intellect. And that means the theology of the laws. That, I believe, is a connection. So that the theology would be the highest subject intimated here. What do you say about that?
I think that, as you said before, this is the first time that philosophy raises its head. And I think it does point to the problem one many ideas. But I don't quite see directly the relation to virtue.
What is the relation to virtue of what?
Of this reflection, of this philosophical reflection.
Well, starting very simply, we must know the telos. the scopos, with a view to which the statesman has to order the city. And this is called with the word, indicated with the word virtue. Yeah? Human excellence. That is three things. And now, here we are confronted with a difficulty, because virtue on reflection proves to consist of heterogeneous and perhaps even incompatible parts. And so one has, this is a tremendous difficulty. Of virtue we heard here in this context only that the highest of the virtues, or the leader of the virtues, is nous. And so it is necessary to consider not merely the virtues, but also nous.
But nous appears here in two ways. One way is it appears as a virtue.
Yeah.
And in the second way, it appears as the ruler of the cosmic world.
Yeah.
These are...
Yeah, sure, but let us assume for one moment that there is a nous as a cosmic ruler. Would this not be a throw light on the human nous? Would this not be very important for the human nous?
The human nous, yes.
Yeah, good. So, and now here what is here assumed is that there is a cosmic nous. And therefore the argument seems to run this, that we are being led from the reflection on the virtues to the nous in the cosmic sense. And this is not possible to do clearly or rationally without reflecting on the soul, on it, i.e. its primacy compared with the body, and B, on the rationality of the heavenly motions and the nous guiding them. But the overall result, I believe, as it seems to me, is that in the context of the laws, the nous and therefore the gods are the highest thing. I think that is one great difference between the laws and the republic, where one could say that the theology in book 2 and 3, yeah, is there, but that is superseded somehow by what is said in books 6 and 7 about the ideas. So that there is a movement from the gods to the ideas, and here just the opposite, which would make perfect sense in the different contexts of the two dialogues, and would leave entirely open the question as to what Plato himself thought. Pardon? Yeah, yes. Yeah, that is the question of what Plato himself thought about that. Yes?
In what sense can one say that here is a movement from ideas to thought?
Well, that needs a justification, you're quite right. But let us say the virtues. Yeah? The virtues. And here, when analyzing the virtues, we find not only that there are many, but that they culminate in or guided by the nous. And therefore, the highest consideration, higher than that of the virtues in general, is that of the nous. And this is practically identical with the theology, in the sense in which there is a theology in the 10th book of the laws.
And the nous defines God.
Pardon?
This theology, the nous defines God.
One could perhaps say this, but Yeah, but then the question comes up on the basis not of the laws, but of Plato's work in general. What is the relation of the nous to the ideas?
I mean, this is theology. I don't say that it is the law or claim, not like that, but it follows.
Yeah, that is all right, but the question is nevertheless, since the laws are only one work of Plato among many, and one would be compelled to raise the question, what, since it is not discussed in the laws, what is the relation of the nous and the ideas? And the solution that the nous is the place of the ideas, and that is the Aristotelian solution, and that one cannot ascribe to Plato without a long argument. So, I don't know.
It is interesting that when he enumerates the four virtues, he does not he doesn't use the word Sophia.
Promises, yeah, I know, that's right. But formerly he had used nous.
Yeah. And so there is a deliberate unclarity
Yeah.
of the relation to nous.
Yes. But I believe it would make sense if in the laws the supremacy of the nous, as distinguished from the ideas, were asserted. The ideas are somehow there as the very questions regarding the virtues show, but they are not the theme in any way. That would be most unsuitable.
It is interesting. It is interesting that starting with structure, with positive laws, and not mentioning at all philosophy till the very end, the book, the laws, finish by pointing to the most philosophical.
Yeah,
Not philosophical book turns out to be quite philosophical.
yes, well, that would not be too surprising in the case of Plato, who does all kinds of
Therefore, to say that when we started, there was no question about philosophy, and the questions which arose when in reason, questions, we were kind of cutting, not philosophical. That to be done by.
Yeah, but they are not called philosophic here, of course. The word philosophic, or rather philosophizing, occurs just twice in the whole laws. I think the first place we discussed here is somewhere in the 9th book, and where he speaks only of what one would call a philosophizing physician, who would, as distinguished from the mere empiric, who would consider the whole nature of the body. And it is clear that the philosopher would consider the whole nature not only of the body but also of the soul. That is implied, but it is not, the conclusion is not explicitly drawn. Yes?
It's hard to see from what point of view that lack of explicitness is, what principle guides that lack of explicitness. It can't be simply the demands of the political situation or the conversation, but then one could say, well, piety not one of the virtues.
By piety?
Why is that?
Yeah, but piety consists in knowing that the gods are, that they are just and so, and acting accordingly. And therefore it is not, you mean because he mentions 4 virtues and not 5? Yeah, that is true. And especially here in this work where so much had been said about piety, it is particularly striking, you are quite right. But I think Plato is being serious, piety would be identical with philosophy, just as for Aristotle. And the other things which belong to piety, sacrificing and prayers, that belongs to the polis. And therefore, oisebeia is not a virtue in Aristotle's ethics, as you know. And piety is knowledge of God. And knowledge of God is the highest knowledge. And well, what that means is a long question, but this is at least a formally sufficient question. There is one passage which we might perhaps read, it has something to do with what you say, in 967d. Yes?
Plinian, how so?
No, yeah.
Athenian, it is impossible for any mortal man to become permanently God-fearing if he does not grasp the two truths now stated, namely, how that the soul is the oldest of all things that partake of generation and is immortal and rules...
Yeah, you see, of all things which partake of generation, and that could be thought to mean there are things which do not partake of generation, and the soul is younger than they. Yeah?
And rules over all bodies. And in addition to this, as we have affirmed, he must also grasp that reason, which controls what exists among the stars, together with the necessary preliminary sciences, and he must observe also the connection therewith of musical theory and apply it harmoniously to the institutions and rules of ethics. And he must,
all right, of characters.
of characters. And he must be able to give a rational explanation of all that admits of rational explanation. He that is unable to master these sciences, in addition to the popular virtues,
the vulgar virtues, in order to make it perhaps a bit more expressive.
in addition to the vulgar virtues, will never make a competent magistrate of the whole state, but only a minister to other magistrates.
Yeah, let's stop here. So that these vulgar virtues he must also possess, but the core of his being are these other virtues which consist primarily in knowledge, and of which he repeats in a way what he had said about the soul and the heavenly bodies before. Is there any other point you would like to raise? Dr. Katz?
Before, I would see how the loose is here the highest. It seems to me that unless one identifies it somehow with God or the divine, it seems that I think points ultimately to God about spirit, and it is passage even that we read here. Nous is talked about as that which rules the motions of the heavenly bodies.
Yeah.
And the other element that points towards the divine is the soul and the virtue. So I guess that's the identification that you made earlier.
You do not see which identification?
With nous and the divine. But this kind of is the question whether there was
Yeah, but that was meant to be the demonstration of the existence of gods. A, the primacy of the soul compared with the body, and B, the order of the heavenly bodies. And of course, in addition to their being animated. And their being animated is, I think, evident, because without being pushed or pulled, they move. Hence they must have the principle of motion in themselves. Hence they are living beings. I believe the argument, I think I mentioned that, which is tacitly used and tacitly rejected in the first chapter of Genesis. heavenly bodies lower in rank than any laus, which is so contrary to what the Greeks thought of them. Well, then I wish you a happy summer and happy vacation.